It's been a fun couple months, as I'm sure everyone has experienced a lot of change over the last couple months, but it's been fun for us in one sense. It's been thinking through how all of our responsive practices and how all of the things that we've been working with districts on, how we can change and shift in light of this current. And so today we really see this as an opportunity for us to test some messages, to hear what's working, what's not working, share some of our frameworks, learn about what's resonating within your communities, and then hear from you what is actually happening right now when it comes to scenario planning. What are things that you're hearing? What are assumptions and knowns? What are different ways that you're starting to get into that responsive planning habit and those mindsets that we know are so necessary?
Is this idea of responsive return planning. And so Sima, Drea, Anthony, and I, we've been talking a lot about what it means to think about return and sort of move out of the short-term response phase. Like we're past getting meal delivery out, device distribution. How do we start thinking forward to school year 2021? So we pulled an excerpt from an article that we just wanted to give you a second to read over, and pulled out a quote to the right, but I'll mute myself for about a minute if you want to just check out that excerpt. It's so important to get people back out working. I know a lot of us on this call are juggling having young kids at home in addition to full-time jobs that, you know, are still moving forward. And so I think this really speaks to what you were saying, Shalia. You guys are the important people right now. If we don't get this right, if we don't think about return planning in the right way, it could actually have detrimental effects. And so I think there's this balance. If we were to pull out maybe even that word foolproof, sometimes people think foolproof means we need to have this perfect plan. We need to spend months and months making sure that we have every detail right, and then we execute it, and that's foolproof. But the reality is there's so many knowns and unknowns out there. We don't actually know what we're going to be returning to. And some of that might be our decisions as the decision makers for the district. And some of that actually might come from higher up, right? It might come from state government. It might come from someone above. And so when we think about foolproof with responsive planning, we're thinking about it in a different way. We're not talking about making a perfect plan. We're talking about really setting some guardrails for what needs to be super tight and what we might be able to be a little bit more innovative or creative with. The shifts that could happen when you return to school in 2021. And you can just do for 30 seconds, just a brain dump. Nothing has to be perfect, but what are some shifts that you think might be on the horizon? For example, you might say, maybe we're going to create a new master schedule. We don't know what it looks like, but we have a feeling the master schedule is going to change. You might say, maybe we're going to totally eliminate bus service. Maybe we're just going to do lunches in the classroom. We're going to distribute them there and not do cafeteria. Maybe we need to have a different type of PD series. Maybe we have something around trauma informed. But just take the next 30 seconds and list out all the shifts that you think could potentially happen. And above the line, I want you to write okay to fail. So just write the words okay to fail above whatever line you drew. And then below it, write this will sink us. So just like our metaphor of an iceberg, if it's above the line, we have some room to correct. If it's below the line and we hit this or we get this thing wrong, it's going to actually sink our ship, right? So just write those headings, okay to fail, and this will sink us. And really think critically about what would you put above the line. If you didn't get distributing lunches correct, do you still have space to correct? Is that okay to try something new even if we fail? If you don't get bus service right, is that actually going to sink the district? Is that going to be really detrimental? So just look at your list and start plotting things above or below this line, depending on what you think is okay to fail and what will sink you.
Things that are on top are generally iterative.
We've been out of school a long time and there's a lot of gaps to be filled. And I think that's one that we definitely need to get right.
An increase in student illnesses or a return to any situation that would require schools to be closed again.
I think poor communication will definitely sink us. There's no way to come back from that.
When we're thinking about return planning is this idea of when you can experiment, take risks, and still have time to recover, right? So if time is on your side, we usually have more time to recover. One example, I was working with a district who is going to be doing a summer session. And so I was like, why don't you think about what you want to kick off in school year 2021 and just test it out in the summer? Because if it fails then, you have time to recover, right? The things that are below are the ones where you don't have time to recover or it's just catastrophic, right? Public impact, safety, those are catastrophic type of things. So the big thing that I want to leave you with in this section, if we start with that article on foolproof, right? We said like, We want to really be thinking about our return planning as being thoughtful and very foolproof. Foolproof doesn't mean a perfect plan. It just means that we're really, really tight about what we can't afford to fail at. Anything that's above that waterline, we have to be really clear that these are the expectations. That's what we mean by tight. And we're communicating that out, very similar to what Jacqueline was saying. And then we can be, and sorry, that's below the waterline. We can be looser about what is above the waterline, because those are the things where we have time to recover if we don't quite get it right.
I think we've got to have multiple plans. I don't think it could just be one plan. I think we need contingency and then contingency and then contingency. A district my size, we're the 6th largest school district. We're not all going to be reacting the same way. Each school or each area has been affected by this very, very differently. So it's not one plan, it's multiple plans. And depending upon where students go to school, where students live in the district will really determine which plan they follow.
And something that we've noticed is that in an effort to avoid those items that sink us, that could have the potential of sinking us, a lot of our leaders, and both in education and outside of education, are starting to talk about return planning coming from a place of reaction as opposed to a place of response. So when we notice that there's a high degree of ambiguity around what we need to plan for, a lot of times we turn unknowns and assumptions, things we might just be thinking or feeling, into theories. And then we bring those theories into being certainties and facts, and that's what we start planning for. And I don't know about anyone else, but that's when I get in my spin at night. The challenge for us is about how do we respond and create responsiveness as opposed to just a reaction to some of these items. We actually have a lot of possibilities when we think about student learning. If we had a fixed mindset, which is what we're trying to thaw, if we had a fixed mindset, then we may only go back to what we've done in the past, which was majority in-person education and in-person operations. And we might think of, if we have failed in the past in something, that it doesn't mean we should ever try it again. But moving towards a growth mindset, it allows us to understand that we can both improve upon the things that we've learned before, and we can also, through effort and practice and through creativity, we might be able to grow in new areas. So what can we do to broaden our knowledge? What can we do to think creatively about all the different ways that we can reimagine student learning? And as we mentioned, get instruction right. Getting instruction right and being able to be responsive to various scenarios over the next few months is going to be paramount. We've been discussing this deeply across our team, like how do we actually define scenarios? How do we actually identify what scenarios might be ones that districts want to plan for? But we've come up with, we've leveraged a few different definitions and a few different sources, and we're starting to think of scenario planning as a process of constructing narratives about what the future may look like, with the focus on considering what we might do if that future comes to pass. So this helps us avoid being unprepared when the future arrives, and it helps us come up with some stories that would describe the plausible future. The first is a scenario with no physical distancing. The reality is that we may not be here in August or September of next year, or if you're in a school like Wake County, when there's year-round schools that start in July. The reality is that there may be some physical distancing when school year starts, but we may learn that at some point through the school year, we might be able to reenact a plan with no physical distancing. The second scenario is where we are in the building, but there's going to be significant physical distancing. And this is where some of those reactions of half in school, half out of school, A/B scenarios, not having sports, all of those different reaction items start to come into play. And the final scenario is around an extension of distance learning. Now, this doesn't have to look like what we just did in spring 2020, but this could be where we continue having remote learning for the next year.
I would say one of the things that we know for sure is every district is going to have to deal with some version of all three scenarios at any given time. It could be split up by elementary and high school, or it could be early part of the year, you're going to start with physical distancing and then shift to remote learning and then come back to no physical distancing. All sorts of combinations will come up as you think about what to do in the upcoming school year. And so it's essential that teams are ready and fluent in all of the scenarios. As district leaders, that we have to understand is whether we're talking about how people learn, like the learning curve, whether we're talking about the learning pit, how kids learn, or whether we're talking about how change happens, which is the Kubler-Ross curve, change curve. There's always a peak, a dip, and a peak, and then you kind of peak out of it again. And so what I noticed in this is, just like in learning, if you have a teacher, you could like reduce the pit. The change curve, there are ways we could actually soften the dip. And we think that the way you do that by going through a series of small sprints. Each of those sprints are really designed so that people could go on a journey with the team on how to make these changes and how to adapt to all of these changes, because change is hard and it's uncertain, right? We're making these changes in an uncertain world with a lot of ambiguity. And so people are used to a lot of predictability in terms of how schools always got set up every year. And this will help you kind of make that transition as an organization. How do we bring everybody along the journey? And right now, for example, you guys as leaders are thinking about this probably 1/3 of your time, just thinking about how to bring schools back, but not everybody on your team is. And so the way you could bring them along is through these sprint practices, and each stage of the sprint practice has a different purpose, right? One is just aligning on what the scenarios are and what they need to think about so that everybody, it's kind of directional clarity. And then from there, it's like helping people not get into the weeds too quickly, because what we found is that there's a tendency for people to start immediately thinking about the tactical things that need to happen before the strategies are in place and all of the kind of the options. So aligning on vocabulary, aligning on what the purpose is, aligning on the flexibility of roles and what's possible before they come into what's not possible. And I would say they're probably going to need like 6 sprints to move along 100 people, you know, with 100 schools to a point where they could actually start building out school level plans. And I came up with this metaphor that I thought would be helpful for us to use in terms of what's the level of detail that we want to get to by when. So first is just like, we have to have an established goal, right? And the goal is to like provide continuity of learning and safety and all of those types of things. The scenarios we shared a little bit already, which is there's, you know, physical distancing, there's online, there's just back to school. So within those scenarios, we have to ideate on this different design ideas. And then from there, we could build prototypes. And so often people will start with the goal and skip to the actual like prototyping. And what we end up doing is missing a lot of components to the work. And so I use this transportation idea. So let's say the goal was to come up with a mode of transportation. And then one of the scenarios could be ground, it could be air, it could be water. And then once you pick ground, you want teams to start thinking about what's the design, right? It could be a truck, it could be an SUV, it could be a minivan, it could be a semi. And then from there, you come up with the prototype, which is in this case, a Tesla, it could be anything else. And the whole idea is that as you kind of go down the funnel, there's more clarity about what the requirements are. And it's the same thing that we're noticing with reentry plans. Like the goal is to get reentry, but then one of the scenarios is physical distancing. And then as you go in, there's different models of how you could implement physical distancing, like elementary schools having alternating days, or elementary schools taking over middle schools so that every young child has adult supervision. And so as you think about that, then ultimately we're going to get into what prototypes are possible within the district context that you have.
The playbooks for our campuses so that the expectations and the roles are very clear. And then within those parameters, they have a lot of autonomy to personalize things for their communities, for their schools, for their department. So I think that part is really exciting. I think the challenge in all of this is just what we call incline moving the elephant and like dealing with the emotional just aspects of this pandemic that you touched on them just a moment ago, like the way our teachers are feeling, the way our principals are feeling, people's efficacy in some respects are at an all-time low because people that used to feel like really skilled at certain things and felt like they had lots of things under their belt have had to like completely shift into a whole new way of operating. And so then as they think about navigating multiple scenarios all at one time, especially for district leaders, I think that just adds to that low efficacy of like, how am I going to be able to have along this spectrum of virtual and in-person, multiple scenarios perhaps functioning at the same time in a district.
So I agree, Jenny. One of the things that I find exciting about being in this situation is we have a hashtag that we've been using. And in following it, I see a resurgence of excitement about the profession. Even in isolation, I think there's a certain amount of excitement about the newness of it. At the same time, I worry about continuing that level of excitement should we have to have inevitably something different this coming fall. And then again, I get excited because of the opportunities that exist to do some things differently as it relates to teaching and learning and challenging the status quo and rethinking some of the things that we've always done. And how do we go about approaching that systemically without creating fear?
And what I'm concerned about is that once the last day of school, June 3rd comes, the spike's going to come back down because now school is over. So how do we continue to build that momentum to excite our teachers to continue on this path of using the digital tools that they've now developed these skill sets for, while at the same time knowing full well we've got a population of teachers that are totally fatigued?
If we remove the resistance of putting ourselves back into the norm of being like, well, you have to clock in, you have to show up in the office, putting back those parameters, I think people will lose their excitement. And so I hope that as we all plan for what the next looks like, we remember that it should not look like what we did before. It cannot look like what we did before. We don't have to clock in and we're still running payroll. And so it's those fake rules that we create for ourselves that I think limit people. And I think what you're feeling, Kip, is that people took the brakes off, they took the seat belts off, and they're running. So we just have to remember, how do we capture that feeling and use it to benefit and help teaching and learning become something that we've never imagined or dreamed of?
I think one of the things I'm excited about is for us to tackle some of the things that we kind of had on the table before. So I'll use learning loss as an example. I'm sure all of you are talking about learning loss in your district. But then the challenge, I think, for me personally is like the organizational integrity around like learning loss has always been an issue, right? And so it's like, how have we addressed it then? And it's always been something that we've needed to talk about and think about. And so I think on the one hand, what I'm finding is that some of the things that are presenting themselves as excitement also have this parallel to challenge, because again, it raises this notion around us having to face who we've been and what we've chosen to acknowledge and not acknowledge in many cases. And so I think that does present an excitement, but again, I think that just the internal struggle with the integrity around things that we've maybe chosen to let sink in some places.
It's almost like a paradigm shift in how we deliver instruction now. We've been doing it this way for so long. Now we have an opportunity to recreate how we teach our students. And we talked about this iceberg and really shooting, one-to-one devices was down here, and now because of COVID, we're up here. Maybe in some way, we needed this shot in the arm so that we could look at other opportunities or way of teaching. I don't think we would have gotten to this place if it had not been for COVID. On the other hand, with the challenges, I'm concerned about the equity that we're experiencing in our communities. And we call it the haves and have-nots. And so that's going to be a big challenge for us moving forward.
I love that you say that, because I'm in agreement. We've been trying, in my system, we've been trying to push standards-based learning at the secondary schools, at the high schools, for about 5 years now. And this was almost to really propel us as a system and move us forward, that teachers are really like, oh my gosh, yes, we do need to focus on the essentials. We do need to unwrap these skills and standards. We do need to give feedback more often. Look at what we're going through right now. So I do think there are some positives and some blessings that have come out of this that are making us rethink the way that we've always done business.
So the minute that Jacqueline threw out the E word, those glasses that we wear, the equity lens, I just couldn't contain myself. So here we go. Buckle up. There's a difference between evolutionary and revolutionary. And the poses that are in front of us, those possibilities, look what we're doing right now from all over the country. I remember as a young, really, really young principal one day, walking along my campus and wondering, coming out of different classrooms and wondering, wow, if I could have Miss Rodriguez teach all the algebra classes on this particular segment, what would that look like? I even asked our teachers, what if we put in cameras and just transmit the way she teaches this, and then next time you are going to be transmitted to the rest of the class on how this looks, so that we're getting the best from each one of our staff. Because everybody's really good at something, but we're not good at everything. And being able to provide that exceptional learning experience for all kids. We have such a window of opportunity that why wouldn't our best be teaching segments throughout the day for all kids? And I'm pretty fired up about that. That's what happens when you start throwing that E word around.
So Anthony talked about sprints, and we have actually detailed out a 4-step process for that first sprint, for taking all those possibilities, thinking through all of the future, what is possible in the future, and what we also need to do to make sure we stay above the iceberg line.
Or just recognizing that we don't have to have everything above the line perfectly planned. I think Jenny said it perfectly. She's like, we can let schools be really creative with how they do X, but these things we have to be super tight about.
We've come up with a 4-step process, and the first step is around uncovering your knowns and unknowns. And this is a great way to help pull out what are the facts versus what are the assumptions and what are just the opinions. All of the possibilities that we have to plan for, what could be 3 scenarios to plan for? But I like to think about it as being 2 ends. So we have one in terms, we're thinking about physical distancing, one that's optimistic that we're able to all be near each other. And I'm just craving the time where I can just like give a hug again. I don't know if anyone else is craving that. I'm a big touchy-feely person. So that's like my optimistic side, is the ability to give a hug and have school with no physical distancing. And then the pessimistic piece for me would be no school. I can't even see the people, and I can't even give the people a hug. So that's all the way on the other side. And then something in between is where we have physical distancing and safety precautions, but we're still able to be in buildings. So our key assumption today is around physical distancing. We have 3 scenarios that we want to plan for.
What are things that we know? These are things that we would define as facts. And what are maybe some assumptions we're making when we think about this situation? So,
things that you might consider is like, we want to make sure that every young child gets adult supervision during the day, or everybody needs meals. And so like those, depending on your district, may or may not be knowns or unknowns.
I think one of the challenges will be enforcing social distancing, especially with students. I mean, you think about teenagers who haven't been around their friends for a long time, and now all of a sudden they're going to be back in the building, and we're going to have these guidelines, but then how do you actually enforce those? So that's a challenge we'll have to work through.
I also think we know that there are going to be some families as well as students who aren't going to be comfortable with being in a physical space with others. If
I
Go
think
for
that
it.
the families that are willing to send their kids will expect some type of health screening.
I think families, and I was going to say not just families, but I think staff are going to be apprehensive to return. They're going to want the health screenings as well.
We know that data is going to be reported regularly, and that's a challenge right now. We're reporting cumulative data over the last 7-8 weeks, and I continue to point out that of the numbers we're reporting right now, 95% of them that have gone through the process, they're healed. So they're no longer in those numbers, but we're still reporting the cumulative numbers, and the cumulative numbers scare people.
I think we're also going to have to, in my community, at least, if we have some kind of hybrid model where there is at any point where the students are not in school, the parents are not going to have anything to do with them. So we're going to have to consider what's going to happen with those kids if they're not in school. If we go on an AB day, for example, it's not very easy for some families to accommodate that. So
if we have to social distance, there's not actually room for all students to be in school at the same time. We don't have the physical space for all students to be in school at the same time, particularly, that's why we have 9 different calendars in the district with schools that have 4 different tracks. We simply don't have the room.
Social distancing, things like personal protective equipment. I know we're not going to go deep into that, but just being able to procure those kinds of things, we know will be a challenge. Like in mass, being able to get those things for schools will be a major challenge for school districts. Being able to get hand sanitizer and mask and all those things to make people feel comfortable sending their children will be a major issue for school districts.
known unknown is the fiscal impact and human resources impact. If we're going to go to some kind of hybrid, your teachers are still only going to work a certain number of days a week. And if you're going to reduce class sizes, or you're going to do an AB thing or a split day thing, whatever that is bound to affect the staffing model. So I think that I assume there's going to be some kind of fiscal implication.
Budgets are going to be at best the same they were, but at worst reduced.
An unknown or an assumption is that it will have some level of impact on our human resources. Those who decide to hire or not, those numbers could potentially shift, which means that we have to rethink our staffing model.
Teaching and learning, I think, is still a known unknown. We don't know the real impact on teaching and learning. I mean, I think someone said it a moment ago, we've made an assumption, around it, but we won't really know the full impact of any of this for some time, how well our students are learning in this digital, environment or the virtual environment. We don't know that. We are planning for some form of learning recovery, but the full extent of teaching and learning, we don't know that just yet, in my opinion.
What differences we can anticipate is an elimination or reduction in athletics or student activities, the need for more than one entry egress from a building for student arrival and dismissal.
We've also talked about the difference of like all of our large events being remote this year, like our onboarding, our kickoff. We have a big back to school conference. So all of those things would be in a virtual environment instead of face to face.
So what we just did was we built out one scenario. Ideally, what you do with your team is you build out multiple. And scenario 0 is helpful if you want to think through what a typical school year is. What you'll end up doing is you'll want to compare them somehow. We put it in a table to simplify it, but everything that we talked about in terms of transportation in my group, we talked about delivering meals and supporting teachers with instruction. All of those things would live on that left side. And we start seeing comparisons between them. Things that we see in multiple scenarios, such as professional development or things that teachers are going to need, those come to the forefront of having a broad impact. And we realize that regardless of the scenario, it's something that we should be considering and moving forward. And then we start thinking about those areas that touch on two different scenarios. So the more we see something come up as a trend throughout the 3, 4, however many you want to build out, the more we know, we can feel confident building out some of those knowns and known unknowns. When we typically talk about prioritizing, we use a 2x2 that talks about ease and impact. So typically impact is broad and targeted, and you'll notice that we don't talk about high or low impact because we think that nobody wants to plot anything that's low impact. They're just different pieces that can have an impact to a larger group versus a targeted group. And especially when we're thinking about issues of equity, targeted groups might be highly important areas to look at because it just highlights for us where we're making a decision that could be broad, but it might not meet the needs of our students who are most vulnerable or who need support to just be at the right playing field. The second piece is around ease. So ease and difficulty is really relative for how you think something can be easy or difficult, but really we talk about what exists now and how can we adapt something that currently exists to completely revamping and doing something new. That's going to tend to be more difficult. The last piece that happens in times of crisis, which we're seeing now, is urgency. Everything feels urgent, but we have come up with a few different ways to think about what is immediate and where we need to take swift action. Two things to consider are dependencies. So a lot of things in my group that came up was, we know funding is going to be an issue. We don't know when funding is going to be approved. That's a dependency for when we can make hiring decisions. And then the next piece is the commit by timeline, which is when we know we need to make that decision. So sometimes we can commit to commit. We can commit to making the decision at a certain time. So as we determine how we're going to be making decisions and what our dependencies are, you're going to want to communicate that out. So I don't have all of the information now, but I will know it at this point. So I'm relying on this information to make the decision. You should expect the decision for me on this date. So that's something that we think is really important for leaders to be communicating very transparently.
Boards and your community want concrete answers. It's hard not to respond to them that way. And what we found though is that going through this process, at least internally, brings everybody along, and eventually you'll have a more common voice across the district. But it does take time to bring that many folks along, especially because all your districts are so large.
Other ways to connect, we'll also send you our return plan guide so that you can take a look at in depth about what we talked about.
Thank you.
This was wonderful. Thanks for the invite, guys.
So the second question is, I never imagined I would use blank until quarantine.
Trying to find any space that isn't my desk for work. I never thought I would use Zoom with my 3 and 5-year-olds.
I never thought I would use a pair of hair cutting scissors on myself.
I never imagined I would use so many pairs of sweatpants.
The yoga mat that's been rolled up in my garage until the quarantine.
And I never would have imagined that I would use my 4-iron as a gardening tool.
I never imagined that I would use doggy treats as much as I do to keep my dogs quiet while I'm on webinars.
And I never thought I would use my entire home as a daycare / classroom. Every room is set up for our kids, like
garden tools and a tiller until quarantine. I made a garden.
Let me see. That I would have talked to so many important people.
And I never imagined that I would use Zoom, Skype, Google Meet, all of the above.
You notice that we always start our meetings with a check-in. We think it's really important for everyone to know who's in the room, for everyone to have a voice in the beginning of a meeting, and for us just to know a little bit something about each person.